Today we're going to be talking about archaeology and the Old Testament. Welcome. This is the Youth Apologetics Training Podcast. Like I mentioned in the introduction, today we're going to be talking about archaeology confirming the historicity of the Old Testament. I have a very distinguished guest with me today, Dr. Randall Price. Just a little bit about Dr. Price. Dr. Randall Price received his master's degree from Dallas Theological Seminary in the Old Testament and Semitic languages, and his doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin in Middle Eastern Studies with a concentration in Jewish studies and biblical archaeology. He's also done graduate work in Semitic languages and archaeology at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is a distinguished research professor and executive director of the Center for Judaic Studies at Liberty University. He's also an adjunct professor of apologetics at Veritas Seminary in San Diego, California. He was director of excavations on the Qumran Plateau. That's the site of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Israel from 2002 to 2012. And he's been senior archaeologist for the Ark Search LLC expedition to Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey since 2009. In 1993, he founded World of Bible Ministries, Inc., and serves as its president and traveling speaker. Dr. Price is a member of the American Schools of Oriental Research, the Near East Archaeological Society, Institute for Biblical Research, the Society of Biblical Literature, the Evangelical Theological Society, and the Tyndale House Fellowship. He is on the boards of the Associates for Biblical Research, Olive Tree Ministries, and the Pre-Trib Research Center. You could say that Dr. Price is certainly an expert in this area. He's got multiple books. We're going to be talking about them towards the end of this show, and I do plan on having Dr. Price back to talk about the New Testament and archaeology that confirms the historicity of the New Testament as well. But some of the books would include The Stones Cry Out. He's also a forthcoming book very soon coming out, the Zondervan Handbook of Biblical Archaeology, Secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Searching for the Original Bible, The Temple and Bible Prophecy. We're going to be talking to him about several of these books towards the end of today and next time. One thing I do need to warn you about, guys, today, for whatever reason, I have no idea why, but my soundboard gave me quite a bit of problems on this particular episode. Dr. Price was on a cell phone, which didn't help, but my soundboard, for whatever reason, the mute button stopped working. So every time I had to clear my throat, you can hear it loud and clear in the podcast, which is unfortunate because in this podcast, I had to clear my throat many, many times. Whatever the case, the content is still great, and it's an honor to have Dr. Price on. So with that, Dr. Randall Price, welcome to the Youth Apologetics Training Podcast.
Thank you, Michael. Pleasure to be with you today.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. I've been wanting to have you on my podcast for quite a long time. I have, might surprise you, I have a whole list of people that I want to have on the show that I started way back when I first started considering bringing guests on the podcast. And oddly enough, you're at the very top of the list. It's you. So this is something I've been wanting to do for a long time. So it is an honor, and thank you for coming on. And so, friends, today we're going to be talking about biblical archaeology. Dr. Randall Price, he is an expert in this area. He actually has several books on the subject. We're going to be talking about those a little bit later. And so, yeah, we want to talk about various archaeological finds that support the historicity of the Bible. And so skeptics, they're always taking shots at the Bible. They're always trying to take us down one way or another. What are some of the ways right now today that skeptics are going after the historicity of the scriptures?
Well, I don't think that the form of the attacks have changed because the worldview that they have, a secular worldview largely, that drives this results in the same kind of questions. But basically they attack the Bible as not an historical account, but a religious one. And so they say it reflects the religious viewpoint at the time. You can't, therefore, expect it to have accurate historical statements. They view it in light of the ancient Near Eastern literature of the time, and it's just one more of that kind of literature, so it has nothing unique about it. They don't see it as a divine message. They don't see it. They see it simply as a product of the time, and therefore the worldview of that time, the idea that the world was flat, or they had an idea that certain forces of nature caused something. So they try to read that into the Bible, and they try to say that really, the statements in Genesis, the statements in other places reflect the customs and the worldview of that time. And then they also try to say, look, the Bible does not agree with consensus science, and therefore it can't possibly be right because we now, through the scientific method, have confirmed the way the world came into being, the age of the earth, things like this. And so it just doesn't comport with what we read in the Bible. Now, of course, the response to that is, when you come to it from a perspective that it only can be judged on the basis of what we know, what we can see, what we have unearthed, then you have a very limited context to work from. Science has changed throughout time. There's no consensus science as they think. And the result is that when you look at the things in the Bible as compared to the way events and interpretation of events in history, science and interpretation of science, it's changed many times throughout history. The Bible has not changed. It remains the same. In almost every case that I can think of, when we come around kind of full circle, the Bible says what the Bible says, and ultimately science or historical interpretation catches up with it and confirms it. So that's what I think the archaeological record largely does for us. But skeptics want to date everything in the Bible very late in time to remove it from an historical context. They would say, for instance, the whole Old Testament was originated after the exile of the Jewish people and return from exile somewhere, in the 6th century B.C., maybe as late as the 5th century, so we can place it into the Hellenistic period. And what that does is that means nothing that you read the Bible for thousands of years actually took place at the time and in the place it says. And of course, the argument against that is that there's so many accuracies, so many time-based statements and details that no one could have recorded that unless it had been an eyewitness. So these are the kind of attacks that continue to come on the Bible simply because, it is the bottom line, people have an anti-supernatural bias. They don't want there to be a God who would call them to account. They don't want to see these things as statements of deity that will require them to change their life or to believe something they don't want to believe. And the result is they have to attack that right for self-preservation.
And so they come to the table with their own preconceived ideas, a naturalistic worldview that says that millions and millions of years ago, mankind evolved from pond scum on this planet, and then looking at the scriptures, they date all of the various events in the scriptures during the wrong time throughout history, so that when they look at that wrong time and start digging in the dirt and looking at the various records and things that they find that nothing matches that time period that also matches the scriptures. So the deck is basically stacked from the start.
Right. I mean, what we face, for instance, in archaeology is two different perspectives. One of the minimalist, one of the maximalist. The minimalist minimalizes biblical information. In fact, they just exclude it altogether. They generally start with whatever archaeological data they have. So you have to remember that in archaeology, most sites were destroyed in the past. They've been built over in the past and not accessible to people. Much of the material that was there was reused by later civilizations. A lot is just strictly through the process of time gone. And so we have a very limited amount of information. Well, if that's all you have to build your case on, and you don't find something in that limited context that you find in the Bible, and you say, well, see, the Bible is wrong because we don't find that in historical context. Well, that's, of course, a very skewed way of looking at something, because the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you don't find it yet or don't know about it, well, then obviously doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just one site in Israel, the site of Tel Hatzor, it'll take over 700 years at the rate we're going to excavate that fully. Well, there are many, many secrets there and many things that the Bible talks about that took place there, but who can wait 700 years to decide whether or not they believe the Bible? So if you wait on the basis of the data that you have to have every single thing confirmed archaeologically, you'll wait long beyond your lifetime. That's not going to work. The maximalist, on the other hand, says, look, the Bible is an historical document. It is one that has been proven in terms of historical statement and archaeology, many other types of things. The result is, just like any other document we have, it gives us the more complete source of information. And so when we have the limited context of archaeology, we simply fit that into the larger context of the biblical document and find support and find parallels and find, complement. But because we start with the Bible, and that means we have to presume that it is accurate, that it is a document, then we can find things within the archaeological record. Without the Bible, the archaeological record just stands as a natural or secular testimony to some limited part of history. With the Bible, in the context of the Bible, where you're digging into the very places the Bible mentions, the very time period the Bible mentions, and you find these correspondences, then you know that at least the document was useful and, in fact, argues for starting with it rather than simply isolating it and starting with the science.
Well, what kind of things? Let's jump right in. Let's look at some of these finds. What types of things that have been found support the historicity of the Book of Genesis?
Well, there's all kinds of things. I mean, I think Genesis has far more to support it than many other books in the Bible. That seems strange because the skeptics will say that the earlier you go in history and the more mythical the context seems, like people claim Genesis is, that you would have little information. And that's not the case, in fact. We have more. There are whole books published on this. The Near Eastern archaeological accounts that parallel things such as the creation, the flood, the fall. We have the Enuma Elish, which is a Syrian document that talks about the creation and the flood. We have the Gilgamesh epic, which talks about the flood in Tablet 11. And we know Gilgamesh, who's mentioned in the tablet, is a historical figure. We have statues of Gilgamesh and other accounts about him as a king. He's mentioned in the Sumerian king list. So, we know it's an accurate historical figure. This isn't just mythological. We have the Adapa account, which deals with the creation, but also with man put in a responsible position over the affairs of God, given a test relating to food, failing, and then being judged by the gods. All of this is very similar to what we find in the fact of Adam in the garden. There's even the mention, of a tempter and all of this. We have, my goodness, let's think of some of, if you think of just the prevalence of figures such as the cherubim. You can call them griffins, you can call them sphinxes, call them other things. They go from the earliest Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Syrian, Babylonian, all the way through Greek and Roman periods. This kind of iconography, these figures, guardian figures. We see similar ones on buildings today. The two lion figures you'll see in front of libraries or public buildings. Those harken back to what we find in the book of Genesis when it says that God placed two cherubim stationed on the east of Eden to prevent man from returning to the garden. I think it was such a dramatic thing, a memorable thing that just persists in all of the different religious cultures of time. Just in the last, I guess, probably decade has come out the excavations of Göbekli Tepe. This is in southeastern Turkey. It's now considered by some the oldest archaeological site in the world. Conventional dating dates between 10,000 and 12,000 BC. What's interesting there is you have this complex of, there's standing stones, T-shaped stones, and on the stones are carved pictures of animals, priests with their hands raised, all kinds of things. And the whole site was later buried under sand, not to destroy, but to preserve it. And what's interesting is this dates from just after the time of the flood. And so, what's on the minds of people? This is only a couple hundred miles away from Mount Ararat. So what's on the minds of people? Well, the animals, which are ubiquitous, are all over the world. There's a small number of people. They want to give some sense of worship to God. So this is a ritual structure that's constructed. People are still trying to understand it. It's an amazing sight. When you come to something too like the story of Noah's Ark, we mentioned a couple of things that deal with that. Just in the last couple of years, the Simmons Ark tablet was discovered. It was discovered as someone donated a Babylonian tablet to the British Museum, and as it was read as an account of building the ark and setting the ark on the waters, and the ark is a huge vessel. But it also, for the first time in any of these Near Eastern accounts, mentions that the animals were brought on the ark 2 by 2. Well, that's a detail in the Bible that it's amazing to see it in another document that predates the Bible, but it's there. Some of these other accounts mention the ravens and the dove, and they mention landing on a mountain and offering worship afterward. There's so many parallels that say this just cannot be some made-up story. Now, of course, people will turn around and say, well, it's not a made-up story. The Bible picked it up from these ancient Near Eastern documents and the stories that were from long ago. Problem is that when you look at these documents, they're extremely mythological. They certainly have, I think, an historical core, so there's a common memory of the flood. But it's styled according to the religious viewpoints of the people that present it. Whereas the Bible is presented almost in a non-religious way. It's very structured, the days and the time of the event, all of these things. And the Bible doesn't have those same elements. Now, we know this. We know that myth over time only becomes more mythical. It doesn't become more historical. And if you start with myth, you're going to end up with myth and probably even a greater myth. So if the Bible started with these myths, it should be more mythical, but instead it reads more historical. So one cannot borrow from the other. What happens is they both have this common historical event of the flood that happened, and so they record these details. I mentioned the Sumerian key list. That's a document. There's different versions of this, but one of the unique things there is it mentions that you have the extreme ages of kings before the flood, and then it says kingship was removed from the earth, and then after the flood, kingship was restored to the earth. And so it has the flood as a dividing point. But then afterward, it lists more kings, but their ages progressively go down to pretty normal lifespans. Well, that same thing is seen in the book of Genesis. Before the flood, we have longevity. You have people living 900 years and plus, like Methuselah. And then after the flood, the ages start to drop until we get to Abraham, in the hundreds, and then finally gets down to the lifespans we have today. So these kind of details show there's something going on that is, these, as I said, these are real kings in these lists. So this is an historical document. So if something is being observed, this is a realistic account. We have, just say something like the Tower of Babel also, some people think is mythological. We know these great ziggurats existed from the Sumerian period, the earliest period onward. But we have a stele called the Tower of Babel stele, in which Nebuchadnezzar II talks about how he was a great restorer and a builder of religious places. And he talks about how he built this tower to the heavens and then laid these bricks and all. It's very similar language that you find in the Bible. Now, of course, this is long after the time of the Tower of Babel, but it's in the same place. And we're talking about someone who restored an ancient place, and this could very well refer to that. So on and on it goes. There's so many more things like this, but the book of Genesis has, if viewed correctly, great deal of historical attestation.
Amazing. What about Exodus?
Exodus is probably also one of the more maligned books, and a lot of the problems with Exodus deals with the dating.
Right.
You have archaeological data, you just have to find the right time period to put it in, and so there's debates over that. But even without those debates, you have the question, who wrote the book of Exodus? Well, of course, the Bible tells us Moses did, but then that's assuming Moses is a historical figure. What we know from studying the Hebrew and the way the Hebrew is written, it reflects someone who knew Egyptian, because there are words used that only fit an Egyptian context. We know that whoever wrote these things were eyewitnesses. When it talks about the names of certain places and individuals, or even a name like Moses, Tutmosis and Amun-Moses, and all these different Egyptian figures, his name itself has an Egyptian flavor. Talking about midwives, talking about certain customs and cultures, and how they made the bricks, and how everything that we find in the book of Exodus fits an exact historical time period. It doesn't fit another time period. It is always someone who exists far after this period of time, or writing from a different place entirely, could not have come up with these details, which are very time-based. I think also, if you look at something, and I'm drawing parallels from what we know, I think there's much more that can be said, and I'll say it in just a second, but take something like King Tut's tomb. That was a tomb that had not been plundered in antiquity, not completely, so they found a number of things. One of the things, a couple of things, they found King Tut's actual tomb and sarcophagus. It's got a huge wooden building around it that has carrying poles. Inside is a sarcophagus. On it are winged figures, one on each side with their wings touching. There were boxes found also in the tomb that were wooden boxes with carrying poles, as well as smaller ones that had a shrine of a god on the top of it. Very similar to what we have when we talk about the construction of the tabernacle, because the King Tut's actual sarcophagus was huge and had 3 parts to it. And then the Ark of the Covenant. We know that the people who made the Ark of the Covenant came out of Egypt. They probably had their skills developed in Egypt, so as they built the Ark of the Covenant, it fits that. King Tut existed only 75 years after the time of Moses, if we take the early dates for these events. And so you have a very parallel and things like that. We do have people who are doing hard work today to try to bring about Egyptian evidence for the Exodus. Brad Sparks is someone I know. He's working with parallels from Egyptian literature, in which he thinks he finds actual statements about the Exodus reflected there. Doug Petrovich, who is an Egyptologist, has been working with Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions from Serbet al-Qadim. And these are some of the oldest that we know. They come from the very place where the Israelites were. And if he properly is reading these, then we have some parallels there that reflect to statements people are making as they're in the Sinai about the events of the Exodus and even Moses. This hasn't been published, so it's the kind of thing that hasn't yet been studied, but this is the kind of thing that's being done, and so we really believe the evidence is out there. I'll just give you one other example. We have the Ipuwer papyrus. This is in the Leiden Museum in the Netherlands. Its dating is somewhat ambiguous, but it may come from a time later than the time of the Exodus. Not much later in some cases, but it reflects almost, and I'm saying almost exactly, line for line, item for item, the 10 plagues that were in Egypt. And I mean, you could say, well, this was just talking about another plague. But how could it be when it has the exact same structure as the previous plague, the one recorded in the Bible? So we have these kind of parallels that still have to be discussed by scholars. I'll say this, just kind of including this. When you think of the Exodus, you cannot explain the people of Israel historically or theologically apart from an Exodus. For what, 3,000 years, we've had the Passover and the event of the Passover celebrated continuously by the Jewish people. What was the source for that? What was the cause of that? What has bound them together as a people, given them an origin or history? The only thing that explains that is an actual event, which the Passover talks about. That God intervened, He brought them out of Egypt. There was a Passover in which they were released from their bondage, and others were punished, and they were set free at the cost of the blood of the lamb that was sacrificed. So this is the kind of thing that, when you're looking into it and with some, I'll almost say, objectivity, you'll find that the book of Exodus has a great deal of historicity.
Yeah, amen. And so, all right, so Moses and the Hebrews, they exit Egypt, they cross the Red Sea, they end up in the wilderness for 40 years, and then there is this event of the conquest of Canaan, where Joshua crosses the Jordan into Canaan, and they take the place. What kind of evidence do we have for that conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua?
Well, like the other sites, this is also a debated account, and based on the fact that different archaeologists working at different periods have supposedly produced different results. The earliest excavations took place in the beginning of the last century, wrote confirming that the site of Jericho was a site that, had validity and fit the biblical account. And then in the 1950s, a woman named Kathleen Kenyon, a British archaeologist, excavated there. Her conclusion was, because she excavated in a different area and didn't find certain kinds of imported pottery and other things that fit a certain time period, she said, well, the site of Jericho was already destroyed and uninhabited when Joshua came into the land, so there was no Jericho for him to conquer. Well, she didn't publish her results for 35 more years. And when she did, people who looked at that said, you know what? She was wrong. It's just not the case. We have in earlier excavations plenty of examples from the tombs of the late Bronze period, the time the Bible records for this. She found evidence of fallen walls, but she attributed that this is Middle Bronze period. Well, my personal opinion is that much of the walls were Middle Bronze. At the time When we talk about time period, we're talking about maybe 100 to 150 years between when this wall may have been built and when Joshua came in. These walls would have remained. They had a stone foundation, a mud brick revetment wall above them. And the issue is that why tear down your wall and remake another one? There's no need to. This wall is good enough. That wall was still there in the time of Joshua. But let's just say from her account as well as earlier accounts, we know exactly what happened there. And the archaeological evidence shows that Jericho was a fortified city. That's something the Bible says was the case. We also know it was destroyed by fire. The Bible says that 3 cities were destroyed by Joshua, and this was the first of them. And then we know that the fortified walls collapsed. And they collapsed in such a way that the Israelites could then run up and invade the city. And there's evidence, of course, of these collapsed walls, no question of that. Then we know because they found grain, big jars of grain that had been burned, part of the destruction, but grain just simply is preserved by being burned. And so here we have these huge jars of grain. Well, what tells us that? It tells us that you wouldn't have that much grain unless it had been the time of the grain harvest. That happens in the spring. And the Bible says that Joshua and his forces conquered Jericho in the spring. It also tells us that they only marched around the city for 7 days. So it was a very short siege. And having that much grain indicates that, well, of course, they didn't eat it up. If they'd been under siege for a long period of time by some enemy, the grain would have been consumed, but it's all there. And then
the
Bible tells us that. Yeah, the Bible tells us that. And then the Bible also tells us that God said that the Israelites were not to take anything out of Jericho. It was under a ban.
Yeah.
So, and that included the grain. So if the people didn't eat the grain, neither did the Israelites. They didn't take it with them. So every little detail we find archaeologically supports the biblical account of the conquest of Jericho.
That is awesome. What about some of the other cities like Ai and any other of the cities that seem to fit the biblical account?
Certainly. I mean, we have, I should have mentioned also the things, well, I'll mention it in a minute, but just, we have the site that's traditionally referred to as Ai is basically at Tel, they call it, and Albright had discovered it. Problem is it has no remains left from the time of Joshua. They were either removed or quarried, and other things took place. There's just nothing there. So you can't confirm anything. You may say geographically it's not the right place. But right near there is another place that has been excavated for the last 20 years, a place called Kirbat El Makarta. Now, we don't know absolutely for sure that that's Ai. The archaeologists doing this feel very strongly that it fits the biblical account. But what they discovered, they have walls, they have gates, they have things that fit that time period. They certainly have features that would fit the idea of Ai. Ai, though, is called, in Hebrew, it means heap or ruin. And so it's not meant to be a huge city. And that also fits with their excavation sign. So we don't have real confirmation of Ai yet, but we have work being done that may confirm that. And I think that's always an encouraging thing, because with archaeology, it takes a long time for some of these results to be seen.
Are you ready to move on, or is there something else there with Joshua and Canaan?
Well, we go on to the book of Judges. I mean, the conquest of Canaan is also seen in the book of Judges, so we talk about that. I mean, it's continuing conquest and settlement. So if you move on to number 6, if your questions, I can say a little more.
Yeah, right. And I've heard very little confirming the book of Judges as far as, the things I've read and some of the videos I've watched. What say you? Well,
the book of Judges, we're talking about the 12th to the 11th centuries BC. Maybe I'm certainly even before that, 13th century to the 11th century. But you have a situation where Israelites or Hebrews come into the land. They don't have anything. They're nomadic at this point. They've only brought with them as a slave people what knowledge they have. They settle into the native population. And they basically, their styles of pottery differ very little. They're more plain than the Canaanite pottery, which is painted. But they're inhabiting. That's what God says. You inhabit buildings you did not build. You're taking over vineyards and things you did not plant. I mean, God gave them this land, and they conquered these things. So when you're looking for them as a distinct people at this time, it's hard to find. Nevertheless, there have been over 250 sites that have been discovered in the hill country north and south of Jerusalem. These are settlements. These are emergent people who came in. They just appear. And, some people say, well, these are people who came from the Jordan or whatever, but there's no documents to confirm it. But the Bible tells us that the Israelites emerged at this point. They settled in this land, in the land of Canaan. And so, given the documentary evidence of the Bible, this best identifies these people. So we know they're there. We know from Egyptian stele called the Stele of Merneptah, it shows us, it states it, that Israel was in the land. It was a nation. It's considered a nation state in the land of Canaan. And the Merneptah stele is dated 1219 BC. So we already have a statement that Israel was in the land, settled and established, recognized as a people by the Egyptians at that point. So it tells me that this is the settled people during the time of the Judges. We even have an earlier document, still somewhat debated by scholars, but it's called the Berlin Topographical Statue Bas Relief or the Berlin Pedestal. Can be dated to the time of Amenhotep II, somewhere around the 15th century BC. And it mentions also Israel along with Canaan and Ashkelon. And this is what you see on the Stele of Merneptah that's later in time, but the same people group is mentioned earlier. So it at least testifies in some sense that Israel was seen as a distinct people even that early. But that's before the time of the conquest and the settlement. But it recognizes that the Egyptians recognized them then, and they recognized them later as being one of the peoples of the land.
That's really good. So moving on to King David, the book of the 1st and 2nd Samuel, King David's pretty noteworthy character throughout the scriptures in Israel's history. I have heard lots of skeptics take shots at the Bible and say that King David never existed. Is that true?
Well, until recently, that was true, and not that he didn't exist. He didn't exist within the archaeological record.
Right.
One of the women I mentioned, Kathleen Kenyon, an archaeologist, said that we have no evidence of King David or King Solomon in the archaeological record. But that changed in the 1990s with excavations at Tel Dan, the northern part of Israel. They found upside down and sticking in the wall pieces of a monumental stele that had been erected by Hazael, one of the enemies of Israel, and he had defeated the northern king of Israel, and also he considered the king of Judah, and so Israel in its two parts, which they considered as one people, and they said, "I have defeated the king of the house of Israel and the house of David." Well, when he says house of David, he's referring to the Davidic dynasty. If you have a house of David, you have to have a David to have a house. and so you've got an historical figure mentioned, and it's not mentioned by Israelites trying to create origin history or create some kind of heroic myth. No, this is mentioned by the enemies of Israel as a historical statement, 100 years or more after the time of King David, referring to these kings that came from David's line. So that is a good argument in favor of historical data. Because of that, they've been able to actually restore a line in what we call the Mesha inscription, or the Moabite inscription. There it talks about the house of, and it's speaking about southern Israel. And there you had part of the letters, but not all of them. And based on what this inscription shows, that should be restored also to House of David. So if that's the case, we have two archaeological documents, one we already had but couldn't read, and one we found that mentions King David as the king of Israel, and the House of David continuing after him.
Oh, very good. Very good. What about First and Second Kings? There's like 400 years of history recorded in those books. What types of things have been found to support the history that we find in those books?
Yeah, well, later in time we go, and we're talking now let's say, the 8th through the 6th centuries BC. There's abundant evidence in the archaeological record, and most of even the skeptics agree on the history at this point. They differ on events that have a theological tone to them, like Sennacherib's invasion, Jerusalem, and angelic intervention and things like this. But they won't differ with the details and the facts that happened because there's so much archaeological evidence. Now, where there's been more debate has been the 10th century BC, when we had the founding of the Kingdom of Israel. And of course, First, Second Kings, and Chronicles, even Samuel before that, have a lot to say about this because King David and King Solomon established the kingdom. But a lot of archaeologists were saying at one time, we don't have any evidence of the 10th century. Jerusalem probably didn't exist. This is a mythological reading of history. Just couldn't be. So they tended to have their day in the field until probably about 6-7 years ago. A site called Kiryat Keyefa came to light. It's on the boundary of Judah, and it's located right near the place in the Elah Valley, the very place where David had his contest with Goliath. And there we see in the excavations inscriptions that show that there was a scribal activity going on, people recording documents. We found there's a palace there, a palace from the time of David. Can't call it necessarily David's palace, but it's a palace over which David certainly exercised authority. There's all kinds of other religious objects and things found here. The excavators themselves, which are Israeli, said there's no doubt that we have a 10th century, and maybe even going back to the 11th century, time of Saul, an established city here. Now it's on the very outskirts of the Judean boundaries, which means that if you had these kind of smaller cities that well fortified, with a scribal activity going on, religious affection, a palace, what would you have had in the capital city of Jerusalem? Now, the problem with Jerusalem is that it's been built over for centuries and centuries. So you can't tear down existing buildings and homes and things to get to that archaeology. What we have excavated, things like in the city of David, and it's called that because it's where the city began. And there's immense archaeological evidence there. There's evidence of ritual structures that go back even predating the time of David, of walls, of water systems, all kinds of things that are utilized, mentioned at different times in the Bible. Perhaps even the one mentioned later by King Hezekiah of a conduit or a water system that took water from the Gihon Gihon Spring and channeled it into the city so that invaders like the Assyrians and others could not get that water source. They disguised the outside source and then had the water flowing underground. We actually have a water tunnel cut like that through the solid rock mentioned in the Bible. We have cities, like Hatzor and Gezer and Megiddo, all mentioned in the Bible, all with the same gate system, all with the chariots, the stables, the things that are mentioned there. So we have no question that those are biblical cities. Even from the First Temple period, we don't have remains we can clearly identify of the first temple, the Temple of Solomon. We have identified a wall built by Solomon. Lot-Mozar has identified this and explained this was built by Solomon. But most of that, of course, was destroyed and built over again when a second temple was built, then destroyed by the Romans later. So it's so hard to put these pieces together. But what is being found shows this. Now, the one thing I could add, we have, like one account, for instance, I mentioned Sennacherib, the Assyrian monarch attacking Judah. We have his palace in Nineveh has a 90-foot relief showing in detail how he attacked the city of Lachish, one of the Judean cities. It explains it all, and you can see it like if someone took a photograph of the whole thing. It's there. And then we have the Taylor Prison. This is a octagonal-sided cylinder that is Sennacherib's own account of attacking Jerusalem. In that, he mentions that he had King Hezekiah of Judah shut up like a bird in a cage. But he said he records that he did not actually conquer the city as he did these other cities. And the reason for that is explained in the Bible. We have nothing in the history that tells us why that happened, but we know that it happened. And so the Bible gives us the best explanation for that. We have, throughout this period of time, seals that show the names of different people. For instance, Hezekiah, that was mentioned. We have seals with his name on it. One of the most familiar stamps on jar handles is called the Melech seal, belonging to the king. And it's clearly from the time of Hezekiah. We even have a seal that has an image of King Hezekiah on it. Uzziah, who was mentioned in the book of Isaiah, in the Kings this time, and the father of Hezekiah. He was entombed with the Judean kings, and then later his tomb was moved. And in the Second Temple period, they put a new stone on this place where his bones were, and it says, "This is the tomb of Uzziah, king of Judah, bone open." And you can see these in the museum. So we also have the Babylonian Chronicles. These are cuneiform tablets. We don't have like a complete chronology of them, but they tell us many of the details mentioned in the Bible. For instance, Nebuchadnezzar, the second siege of Jerusalem. We have the actual fall of Jerusalem. We have that tablet. We have all the other details. From the same kind of time period, maybe a little after, we're talking about exile. We have a ration tablet for King Jehoiakim, who was taken, this kind of bridging the gap. The Babylonians captured him. He was the last king of Judah, and they took him, blinded him, took him over to Babylon and put him in prison. But we have from the Babylonian account an actual ration tablet, the food he was given as a royal prisoner, and his name is mentioned. So you have these kind of things all throughout this period, and the whole book's written giving more and more of the facts and details from these books of same kings and chronicles.
Okay, well, what about following that? Babylonian captivity took place, and then the Jews eventually received that okay to head back to Jerusalem, and we know that not very many of them went at first, but the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, they talk about that. What types of evidence do we have for those two books?
Well, quite a bit, of course. As I've said, the later in time you go, the more material that is, we have available to us. Concerning the event of the Jewish people being allowed to leave Babylon, now under Persian control, and go back and settle in Judah, we have something called the Cyrus Cylinder. This is King Cyrus who gave the original decree, and it's not necessarily an account of the specific biblical event, but it describes that King Cyrus wanted to take people who had been brought from other countries and had been settled in the land of Babylon. He wanted to take them and restore them to their native lands and pay for the restoration of their temples. And that's exactly what happened in the case of the Israelites. So we have an historical document that says, here's who did it, here's how it happened, and that's, of course, what we find in the Bible. We have people like mentioned in the book of Ezra, chapter 2, verse 46, a family named Hagav. Hagav is simply one of the families mentioned in this list of families that came out of Babylon and into the land of Judah during the post-exilic period. And a seal was found with Hagav's name on it, mentioning, that he's one of these families that's found in Jerusalem. He was actually apparently an important figure. So we can actually document some of those actual families. Xerxes is mentioned in the book of Esther. He was the husband, the king, the husband of Queen Esther. There is a whole Xerxes inscription for Persepolis that talks about him in detail, establishes his historicity and how he treated others under his control. So as we look at this period of time, not only do we have a lot of parallels in terms of customs and practices, we have the actual people and names and events recorded.
Right. Okay, what about this then? There are all of the prophets that you find throughout the Old Testament, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Hezekiah, and the like. Obviously, they all fall within that 400-year time period of First and Second Kings for the most part. What type of evidence do we have for the existence of those prophets?
Well, what you have to do is you have to say these are people who were used by God from all different walks of life. Amos was the British shepherd. Other people were statesmen, but they had a message for their time and the cultural situation of their time. But while they're recorded in the Bible, they may or may not have been recorded in the archaeological record. We don't have a lot of their names mentioned. But we have names mentioned that they mention, people and events mentioned that they mention. And we have, for instance, Jeremiah, the prophet. He had a scribe, his name was Baruch. And Baruch wrote the book of Jeremiah as Jeremiah dictated it. And we have actually a seal, probably a seal that was put on the original book of Jeremiah, but it was burned by the king at that time. And this was found in some of the archaeological remains in the city of David, right, where it would have happened. Although this one came through the antiquities market, they trace it back to that. And it has on it the name Baruch. And it's from this time period. Well, we think that's the very Baruch who was described in Jeremiah. Isaiah mentions a figure named Shebna and complains, and actually is recording God's complaint against this individual because of his pride. He builds, it says, a tomb. It makes himself out to be like a royal figure, a king, because he has his monumental inscription on his tomb. Well, this tomb was actually found, and the inscription does boast his royal connection as a steward, as all. But because we have this, we know that this is a person Isaiah knew Isaiah. So we can go back. We have different things too. When you talk about Jonah and the great fish, not the whale, but the great fish. And people say that's probably the most mythological stories in the Bible. Not so. When you come to the book of Jonah, well, we don't have anything that mentions Jonah's name, right, per se. What we have from the Babylon Chronicles and others that show us what was going on in these times. In Assyrian records, It tells us that there were events that happened over about a decade of time. Famine, plague, revolts, eclipse of the sun, many other things that all ended in the year 758 BC with a more peaceful situation. Well, if you look at Jonah and date it according to the biblical dating, 758 is the time he would have come right there to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and preached, repent, or God's going to judge you in 40 days. Now, they certainly would have believed that message. What would have made them believe it? Well, all these preceding things that God had caused to happen in their culture that made them think that, things were against them. More than that, they had been polytheistic before, but just before this time, there was a shift to monotheism, in which they looked at one God responsible for all of these acts. And so Jonah preaching one God and says God's going to destroy it. Hey, don't have to tell us twice. It's been happening. And so when he speaks and they repent, then the situation changes. And it's 100 years until that changes again, and God judges them finally, as we see in the book of Nahum. So these kind of things corroborate the activities and the setting historically of the prophets, even if we don't have their direct names. But their names persist throughout history. We have people, with biblical names today. We have Zeke for Ezekiel. We have certainly Jeremy for Jeremiah. We have people with all the biblical prophets' names. There had to be some reason for that. They had to have existed at one time and done the things the Bible said they did, in order for their names to be perpetuated, in Israelite culture, and then also in a Judean Christian culture that is drawn from the Bible.
So we've managed to make it through the entire Old Testament, talking about various finds that confirm the historicity of so many events throughout the scriptures. And friends, there are so many archaeological finds out there. We covered just the tiniest little sampling. One book out there that actually discusses quite a few, but I would imagine still yet there's so much more, but really covers quite a few finds, is Dr. Randall Price's book, The Stones Cry Out. Dr. Price, do you want to talk about that real quick?
Well, this is a book I wrote for a popular audience, for young people as well as others. It simply takes the events we talked about in the Bible, stories you know of in the Bible, but gives the archaeological historical evidence for them. And not only for the Old Testament, but also for the New Testament, the time of Jesus. And so the stones crowd is drawn from a passage in the book of Luke, in which Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and the disciples and all the people following him are, welcoming him with platitudes that speak of him being the Messiah. And the Pharisees say, tell your disciples to stop saying this. He says, I tell you, if these keep silent, the stones will cry out. And I think he had in mind all of the city of Jerusalem right in front of him that had witnessed all of this history we just talked about. In other words, if those stones could speak, wow, what they would tell us. We have living witnesses that can tell us that. But I think we now have the archaeological record that can tell us these things. And I think in God's providence, he's preserved many things. I said at the beginning of our program that archaeology is a very limited context. You don't have that much. But I can add to that, even in that limited context, what we have supports, confirms, corroborates, the information we have in the Bible, so that we can know it's a trustworthy text. And that's what I tried to put in our book, The Stones Crowd, so that people would have that information.
There is a video as well associated with this book. I would imagine made somewhat after the fact. Really good video. Yes, it's a little bit older, but it's got some great content in there. Something else you mentioned when we started talking today is you're working on another book, and it's actually due out fairly soon, hopefully this fall or next spring. the Zondervan Handbook of Biblical Archaeology. Tell me about that.
Yeah, Dr. Wayne House and I have been working on this together for a number of years, trying to get some of the latest archaeological information, the latest finds, and put those in a handy kind of form so that a person can start in the book of Genesis and go through the book of Revelation. If they're working on a certain passage of the Bible or want information that helps them in certain areas of the Bible, they can turn to that and find it. It's going to be a full color book with lots of information, but also pictorial information, so this can be put together. And I'm told that'll be available in 2016. I can't tell you exactly when.
Okay, that's exciting. That is something that I will be putting on my wish list for sure. Well, yeah, Dr. Price, friends, we're hoping to have Dr. Price back. We're going to talk about New Testament archaeology. So look forward to that. God willing, I really would like to have you back on. Dr. Price, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. Look forward to talking to you again.
All right, we're going to stop right there. Again, guys, that is Dr. Randall Price. And yes, God willing, I'm going to have him back on here in the next week or so that we can talk about biblical archaeology as it pertains to the New Testament. So look forward to that. And with that, I love you guys. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.